Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Aparutade sangamatassa tavara. Ye sodavantava munjantu satam. So this afternoon is this opportunity to listen and reflect on the way it is, so that what I say, the words you hear, how they affect you, be the witness. So this is a reflective style of teaching which encourages one to look inward rather than to just create more thoughts and opinions about what they feel or how they are. So that's the kind of essence of Buddhism, is that it gives one an opportunity to reflect on life. What is the purpose of life? Does it have any meaning? Are we just created to eat and procreate, survive and die? Or is there some ultimate value to human existence? These are the kind of existential questions that many people ask themselves. And so generally we're given answers by various teachers, religious texts, or maybe atheistic viewers or whatever. We're given opinions and views from traditional forms or from just intellectual rationality. But the thing that I found so appealing to the Buddhist teaching was the encouragement to actually find out for yourself, to investigate life's experience. And so that's why I gravitated towards the Buddhist tradition. Ever since I was a child, I had a kind of spiritual longing, and which I didn't personally understand. So it doesn't surprise me at all that in my later life, I ended up as a Buddhist monk. But I was brought up in a very kind of traditional form of Christianity, and I was told what to believe, what was right, what was wrong. And not that anything wrong with that, but it's something I acquired through being told by someone else. And when I became a teenager, I began to doubt a lot of the things I was told I should believe in. And my nature is very skeptical. I have a very critical mind. So I would try to rationalize various doctrines and teachings that when I was an innocent child, I was quite willing to believe in. But in teenage, you suddenly begin to question, what's this all about? Is it, you begin to rebel against what you've been told, or doubt it, or just blindly go along with it. So I didn't have the faith or the confidence to just go along with it. So this whole life that I've lived is a attempt to investigate life, to understand it. And I found in this particular form of Buddhism, in Theravada, the southern school of Buddhism in Thailand, in Burma, Sri Lanka, that this gave the kind of original teachings such importance, where my initial interest in Buddhism developed through Zen Buddhism. And when I was in the Navy in 1955, I was in Japan. I was on a ship that sailed between San Francisco and Japan, and I was given some books on haiku poetry. And being always attracted to Asia, even before I went there, I was always attracted to Asian people and Asian culture. So I started reading these translations of haiku poetry, which is a kind of mystical form of poetry. It's spontaneous, and it's not just idealistic kind of poetry, but it kind of awakens the mind to look at life rather than just in a perfunctory, habitual way, to understand it through the intellect, through the intuition. So when I got back to San Francisco, I went to one of the main bookstores there where they had published D.T. Suzuki's book on Zen Buddhism. And so I became absolutely overwhelmed with that. I'd go out to Golden Gate Park, one of the main beautiful parks in San Francisco, and just read D.T. Suzuki. And also Alan Watts was a great influence because he was a popular writer whose book, The Way of Zen, was a Book of the Month Club choice. But Zen Buddhism, as I understood it, as it was introduced to the Western world, gave you nothing to, you kind of intuitively understood it, but it didn't refer to the basic teachings from the traditional forms of Buddhism, such as Theravada. So when in 1963, I joined the Peace Corps and was sent to Sabah, North Borneo. And that's where I became interested in Theravada Buddhism. I'd have holidays in Thailand and Cambodia. And so I determined when I finished my contract with the Peace Corps, I would go back to Thailand and find a teacher to teach me meditation. So when I returned to Thailand, I could easily get work there, employment teaching English at one of the main universities. And I started practicing meditation at one of the main Bangkok, really old Bangkok temples near the Grand Palace, Wat Mahathat. So that was a particular style of meditation, particular form that was very stylized and rigid, and I found it beneficial at first because it gave me something to grasp. Where in Zen Buddhism I'd try to look at a blank wall and I didn't know what to do because as soon as I sat down and just stared at a blank wall, my mind would just endlessly think and doubt and create all kinds of restless problems. So I gave up on looking at blank walls, where in Wat Mahathat they taught a very stylized technique which I could grasp and use, and where it led to tranquility. So it was very much based on tranquility, on tranquilizing the mind. Then after that I went to, I ordained as a novice monk, Samanera, in Luang Por province, which is northeast Thailand, but it's right across from the Vientiane, the capital of Laos, on the Mekong River. And I spent a year in a little hut, meditation hut. And I took the book that I have recommended to all of you who ordain here, the Word of the Buddha about the Four Noble Truths, the first sermon the Buddha gave after his enlightenment according to the scriptures. So I spent the first few months trying to just perfect this technique that I'd learned in Bangkok. And after a while, the first few days were quite peaceful, but after that, all kinds of strange thoughts began to arise, and anger. I felt angry at life, and I'd always repressed angry feelings. In my family, we weren't allowed to express anger, we just had to repress it. So I was 31 years old and had 31 years of repressed anger, resentment, fear, a lot of fear that I'd never acknowledged. And the anger wasn't directed towards anything in the monastery, because the monks and the nuns in the monastery in Luang Por were very hospitable, very generous people, very welcoming, so I quite liked the place itself. But the anger was just, I could not control it with the technique, the stylized technique. I'd learned it in Bangkok, and I just had to sit there and watch, became the observer of anger. So I spent about 3 months sitting in this little hut in a jungle monastery, and they'd bring food every morning, I had 1 meal a day, and then I just had to sit and watch over 30 years of repressed anger, resentment, and fear arise in my consciousness. And it had nothing to do with the situation, the physical environment I was in. It was just repressed emotions that I'd never looked at closely or understood. My generation of Americans were very much brought up in the idea men should be brave and strong and fearless. And anger was bad, that it was a sin. And resentment was you were ungrateful and selfish. And so with all these assumptions about trying to express my manhood through showing fearlessness, I had a lot of fear, actually, and a lot of resentment for things in the past, and anger. So after about 3 months of this, just sitting and watching, I had all kinds of hallucinations, I had strange emotional experiences, and somehow I had the determination to stay with it. And at that time, the Mekong River overflowed its banks, so that they were, the town of Nong Khai was flooded, and then there wasn't enough food, and I had malnutrition, and I still determined to stay with this situation. And so after 3 months, I suddenly had an amazing, what you might call mystical experience. I woke up one morning and there was no anger, no fear, no resentment at all in my mind. And even though I would try to bring it up and remembering situations I felt resentful about in my life, I couldn't feel anger or resentment. The fear was, well, I couldn't feel fear. There's just this sense of radiant beauty, a kind of luminosity. The little hut I was in looked absolutely beautiful, and the forest, which was not a very beautiful forest, it was scrubby trees, and it looked absolutely like paradise on earth. So this gave me a sense of something had really shifted through just watching my emotions rather than trying to control them or cling to them or make critical comments about them. Just by being the watcher, the witness to the way it was then, I could see that all these repressed emotions of my life were brought on by memories, because nothing in the present aroused resentment or anger. I had before this luminous insight, I had this Buddha Rupa, very nice Buddha Rupa somebody had given to me. And so in my hut, I had a little shrine with a candle. And so I lit this candle one evening, and the light reflected off the Buddha Rupa, and it looked evil. And I became absolutely frightened. I thought, Buddha is evil. It's just really scary. So I rushed outside the hut and started walking in the meditation style, but I felt evil all around me in the darkness, that it was everywhere. I couldn't see anything. It was a very black night with no moonlight whatsoever. Went back in the hut, fell asleep, woke up the next morning. Buddha Rupa looked saintly and peaceful like it usually did. So then I met Luang Por Cha, and who was was my teacher for many years in Thailand. And during this time, during this year-long retreat in Nong Khai, I meditated on the Four Noble Truths, the first sermon that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment. And it always interested me because most religions depend on inspiration about love, and love is a very inspiring concept. And like eternal life, or concepts that lift up the emotions to be inspired by these profound ideals, where when the Buddha was enlightened, after many years of meditation, his first noble truth is about suffering. So this I could relate to, because during this time, I experienced this anger and resentment. It was a lot of suffering, a lot of depression and fears, and I took it all very personally, like this. Maybe I'm mentally distressed, or something wrong with me, or a screw is loose, because I regarded all my feelings in very personal perceptions. But in the First Noble Truth, the Buddha says there is suffering and it has causes. And so I began to see suffering not as something personal, but the experience of just being born in a very delicate form, like the human body, male or female. When you think of your life as a human being on planet Earth, it is about survival. And when you listen to the BBC World Service in the morning, which I like to do, you hear all the news about the wars going on in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and how many people were killed, innocent children and babies and women and old people, and you see the power of wars. What is one human life worth when you can just bomb apartment buildings or schools or hospitals and just call it collateral damage, where all these human beings, when you see them as we share this humanity, then they're no longer like enemies, or it's not racial or religious anymore. It's just the recognition of our common existence as human forms, which are delicate and vulnerable and sensitive. So I began to just investigate how sensitive this form is, what I see, hear, smell, taste, touch. What I think memories I have can be pleasant or unpleasant. Just physically, how delicate one is when we've just experienced the COVID pandemic. And in Thailand, of course, it being a tropical country, you have to deal with malaria and other tropical diseases. And so the Buddha pointed to this, that the form that we identify with, the human form, is a very delicate one, very sensitive, in a sensitive universe. So I never really thought of it in those terms, but you start reflecting on the actual experience of having a human body in a universe that you find mysterious. And in Thailand, I remember standing out in a place that wasn't covered with trees, and just looking up at the stars at night and kind of wondering, what is it all about? What's happening in those stars and the moon and the sun? And that is something where, when you think of your life as a monk in a little hut, meditation hut, you're kind of relegated to a very obvious situation. But beyond us lies this mystery of the universe. How did it all begin? Who created it? And and this interest now in going to outer space is the curiosity of delicate human forms trying to understand the vastness of the universe that we are sensitive to, that we experience through what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think. So it's one of the reasons when, like at Chithurst, before Amaravati came into being, Chithurst was all forest, beautiful forest land, and you had huts in the forest, and through my reflective nature and insight into Dhamma, into the way it is, I began to, when I first saw this site, it was a school for children who had learning problems, couldn't learn in the ordinary government schools. And the first thing that impressed me was the sky. It's on top of a hill, and this has a sense of a huge dome above this school. And that particularly appealed to me, my sense of insight into the way it is. I was eager to move into places that are open and vast, rather than just through forested and where you have to watch every step you make. So anyway, the suffering is something to understand, and so the Buddha isn't saying, not making a doctrinal statement that life is miserable and suffering, because that's depressing. But it's to be understood. Suffering is to be understood and not blamed on others. Like my tendency as an individual was to blame the suffering on others, on situations, on people, on experiences that, and I could create ideal situations in my brain, perfect relationships, perfect monasteries, perfect governments. I was very good at creating ideals. But life is not an ideal situation. When you start observing the nature of your own body, it's not an ideal form. It's a changing form subject to old age, sickness, and death. So, and this is what we identify with, is something that is very delicate, sensitive, and easily damaged, and at best grows old, gets sick, and dies. So the idea of identifying with the forms was questioned by the Buddha. Are we really just a limited form, a human form? Are we really just a man or a woman? Who gave us these words? Male and female, or human being. We've made up words. Languages are all made up conditions which are called dualistic ways of exploring life and giving names to things. So if you have male, you have to have female. If you have heaven, hell, good, bad, and all languages, whether they're sacred languages or common ordinary languages, are based on this dualistic structure of the best and the worst, the heaven, the hell, the good, the bad. So I began to distrust the intellectual mind that I'd cultivated through education, and just devoted myself to the intuitive style of reflection, on the learning to recognize behind the forms that we identify with, behind the noise of the world, there is a silence. Just as the forms are now existing in space, and without space the forms couldn't possibly exist. The space is quite obvious, So in Thailand, when I still was training with Luang Por, I'd meditate on space a lot, because I began to develop opinions, views of approval or disapproval to the individual monks I was living with, and I thought, I don't want to do that. I'm just creating, personal views about individuals and about how I feel or how they affect me or how I perceive them. Where the space between the monks, between the nuns, has no personality. It's not good or bad, right or wrong, but it's here and now. And Amaravati, as I've said before, has this sense of spaciousness. It's a wide open space. So space, and then what is it that is aware of space? What is it that allows us to reflect on space, to perceive space through the senses? Is consciousness. So consciousness is the ground of being. It's the very ground of being, which is the end of suffering. When you realize the silence, the inner silence, the peace, the eternal peace that's here and now, then you realize you've reached the end of the journey. There's nowhere to go. So the Buddha pointed to the suffering we create through identifying ourselves with forms that are vulnerable, changeable, get old, get sick, and die. We all have to experience the loss of loved ones, see our parents get old, get sick, and die, see our friends. When you're my age, you've seen so many of your friends pass away. And there's a sense of, loss when you feel the loss of someone you love, someone who's been a friend for years. And then so many people come here with problems with grief because they don't know how to deal with grief, the loss of a loved one. And they think, where did they go? When somebody dies, did they go to some other place? Do they have a soul that goes to some place called heaven or hell? And then they feel this sense of great loss, which is natural feeling. This is part of the human experience, to feel grief at the sense of the loss of loved ones. So we begin to, rather than dread the loss of loved ones, begin to reflect on it. Grief is like this sense of loss of someone you love or knew very well. It's like this. And so you're witnessing loss rather than clinging to it and being caught in a kind of depressed state for a long time, or to just suppress it. We can say, stiff upper lip, don't make a scene. Here in England, you're not supposed to make a scene about grief. It's just not beautiful to see. So we say, don't make a scene. And but I said, grief is a natural emotion that we experience through these forms, these individual human forms. Because we all experience, as we get older, the loss of loved ones, even pets, and we feel grief when they die, get old and die. And that's a part of human life, human experience. So it's not about denying emotions, but understanding how emotions change, seeing how, whether the sun is out, how a sunny day affects you, or a dark, gloomy day, or a rainy day. It's like this. Because these are, as much as we don't want to be emotional about things, like many of us are embarrassed by our emotions because they look weak. For a man, being emotional shows you're weak. But emotions are part of life's experience. And so trying to suppress grief or loss or fear or anger leads to depression. We get depressed. And that's one of the problems of modern societies, is depression. People think a lot, they have ideals, they don't understand their lives or themselves, they don't know how to deal with disappointments or failure, loss of loved ones. And so we say, stiff upper lip, get on with life, don't make a scene, is just a way of suppressing it. And according to the teaching of the Buddha, suppressing emotion is like clinging to it, because you're seeing it in a very personal way, as you don't want this kind of feeling, this emotion. You don't want to feel this way. It's unmanly. You don't want to make a scene and embarrass yourself or your family. And so this is to be seen as strength. But actually, strength is being able to witness this sense of loss and the emotion that you feel. Because life in this realm of human existence is about total feeling. This is a feeling realm. It's not a perfect realm. It's not an ideal realm that we're experiencing through this form. It's about sensitivity and feeling. And these forms we feel life all the time. And when we just try to intellectualize life, the intellect doesn't have any feelings. Like ideals, perfect people, perfect men, perfect women, they don't feel anything. They're ideals you can create in your mind through your intellect, ideals of perfection. But when you really contemplate suffering in the way the world is, you begin to see that life itself, this universe that we experience through these forms, through the senses, is not an ideal universe. It's a changing, evolving situation that we have to reflect upon, we learn from, rather than try to fix everything according to some idea of what's right and what's wrong. So in my life as a Buddhist monk, it's been this journey of reflective awareness, conscious awareness. You realize the pure consciousness that you actually are. When you identify with your body, you see yourself as weak or old or male or female or any other perception you might prefer to identify with. But all these are very changing conditions. So what you realize when you see the truth of the way it is, then you realize the perfection is consciousness itself. And this consciousness is not personal. It's not like my consciousness is inside my body and your consciousness is different because it's inside your body. You begin to realize that these bodies are in consciousness, that we all have this same reality of perfection through realizing our true nature as consciousness, which is called Dhamma in the Pali Theravadan tradition, or in Christianity you call it God. It's here and now, and something that gives us a sense of compassion and understanding, loving kindness, and joy in the experience of life that we have through these forms. So I offer this as a reflection for today.